Yes, thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Well, once again, we stand here having another go at repealing the MRRT, the Minerals Resource Rent Tax, or the mining tax as everybody knows it. So once again, we have the interesting spectacle of, on one hand, a government that's telling us that they've handed down a stinking budget because we have to have structural reform. And that was certainly a phrase that was being used over and over and over again. That was certainly one of the speaking notes that the Treasurer had at the time of introducing the budget, and the Finance Minister. We kept hearing Australia needs structural reform, Australia needs structural reform, and that was sort of an excuse, I suppose, to explain why a budget that a huge proportion of Australians, including coalition voters, actually know and understand is fundamentally unfair and fundamentally goes against the idea in Australia that we all pay according to how we can, and we look after the most disadvantaged people in our society, and we don't actually expect them to make the greatest contribution to the finances of the country when there are other people who are receiving much higher incomes and doing much better from the way the economy is structured, and they get off scot-free. So we have this government constantly telling us that we have to have structural reform. And look, I think many of us can see that we need to have a system, a budgetary system in this country where our revenue is adequate to meet the needs that, as a community, as a society, we agree must be met. And they are needs like having a good quality education system, so that no matter where anyone in Australia lives, no matter where a child grows up, no matter the background of their family, no matter the income of their parents, no matter the social background of that child, and no matter where regionally they live, in Australia we can guarantee that they will receive a high-quality education. So that's a need that we should be able to meet as a decent, civilised community, and one of the most wealthy communities, one of the most wealthy societies on the planet. So that's structural reform, to have revenue that can meet that need. We also have an understanding that in Australia we have a system of health care that doesn't penalise those people who can't afford, don't have as many means as others. Traditionally in Australia we haven't had a system where if you're poor you can't get health care, and if you're rich you can buy the best quality care in the world. We've had an agreement, a social contract, if you like, that we will look after everyone in Australia, and we will have a reasonable understanding and security that if we have health needs, they can be met. There's other areas of the social contract in Australia that we have traditionally agreed to. Issues like mental health. If people have mental health needs, that they will be able to be met and looked after. That if people, through some accident or some issue that's occurred, whether it's a disability that's occurred, whether they've become unemployed, they will be looked after. We will make sure that nobody in Australia starves, that we will make sure that people have opportunities to get back in and participate in the community, in the workforce. And of course, if we're going to have that quality, if we're going to have that civilised structure in this society, we have to be able to pay for it. So certainly the Australian Greens say we need to look at the revenue streams that are available to be able to meet those needs that we have as a community. And that's the sort of structural reform that the Australian Greens are looking at. And so we have a government that's saying we need structural reform, and yet if we look at what's happening across the legislative agenda this week, we have the government intent on repealing a price on pollution, which is actually bringing in revenue, but they are determined to actually repeal that. And here today we're discussing the repeal of legislation that is actually could be bringing in revenue for the country to pay for those other needs that we have. And as a result of actually repealing this Act, if they are able to do so, they will actually, we know, take funding away from other important aspects of Australian services, and we'll go into those in a minute. So what we have here is, in fact, a government that isn't really saying we need structural reform. This government is saying we need to make sure that we look after some people in society, and that will be at the expense of others, and that's what we've seen in the budget. So it's illogical. What we're being asked to do today is illogical. It's a short-sighted government which is basically looking after those who are already doing very well from the way our economy is structured. The Australian Greens supported the Henry Tax Review and the recommendations from that review, which recommended imposing a tax on mining. And we welcomed the tax in its original inception, particularly because it was designed to properly tax the large profits that were being made by mining companies on the basis of mining resources which are finite, that once mined will never be there again, and which are shared. They are owned and shared by the whole Australian population. So, along with the Henry Tax Review recommendations, we thought it was pretty logical that if there are particular organisations that are going to make a lot of money out of mining and exploiting these resources, it's only fair that a fair share of the profits from those resources come back to the Australian population to meet those needs, the health, the education, the mental health needs that I talked about a bit earlier. So instead, though, we didn't have the mining tax, the resource super profits tax that was originally designed to make sure that those large profits were properly taxed, because we had a confected hysteria from the mining industry. We had a sense that, for some reason, that the mining companies here would decamp to some other nirvana somewhere else where they could mine and exploit the resources there without any kinds of constraints at all. And there was this threat of sovereign risk, which I don't think most people ever took seriously. But instead of that, we had this huge campaign with a huge amount of advertising and money and investment into that to protect those who had an interest in keeping the status quo, and ultimately that tax was not pursued. So we ended up with this mining resource rent tax, an MRRT, which was a pallid version of the original tax as envisaged by the Henry Tax Review. And so instead of so the Greens ultimately supported the legislation that we're considering, the act that is intended to be repealed under this particular bill, but we always said that it should have been strengthened, and this act the mining resource rent tax should be strengthened rather than being abolished. And it's clear that experts consider that a mining tax is vital for properly distributing the national gains that are associated with mining. Because this country's finite resources do belong to all of us, and we do know they're finite, and we do know they've been there for eons, but once dug up and shipped away, they're gone forever. They're gone for our benefit, and they've gone for the benefit of future Australians. And the wealth that is inherent in those resources is gone as well. So it's absolutely imperative that when we do exploit those resources, that there is a lasting impact or benefit for the Australian people. Instead of repealing the mining tax, the Australian Greens say the government should actually broaden it to include all minerals, because instead this particular act advantages those companies which don't mine the resources that are currently being taxed, and instead of strengthening it, the government is proposing a repeal bill which will actually then advantage further big companies. We have companies like BHP Billiton, Rio Tinto and Xstrata, worth more than $200 billion together, and they are the ones who will benefit from the passage of this repeal bill. But who won't benefit? Who will suffer? Who will pay the price of this determination to repeal this somewhat inadequate but at least some attempt at gaining an income and a tax from the shared resources that we have? Who will pay the price? And that will be millions of households, up to 10 million workers and hundreds and thousands of small businesses. The losers from this package are workers with compulsory superannuation contributions, households with children and small businesses. So instead of cutting the taxes, reducing the taxes paid by a small number of exceedingly wealthy mining companies, most of whom are foreign-owned, and most of those profits ultimately end up overseas in the hands of overseas investors, rather than coming back to benefit Australians who own the resources in the first place. So rather than cutting taxes on those companies, the government should be enhancing them to raise revenue. An optimal tax system in Australia would ensure that Australians can share fairly in the rich mineral wealth that we commonly own. But this is a shadow. This legislation is a shadow of what it previously was, and the repeal will mean that it no longer exists at all. So currently, the current MRRT contains an effective tax rate of only 22.5% rather than the 40% which was originally proposed. And as well as that, it currently fails to tax profits on gold, silver, diamonds, uranium, rare earths, nickel, copper, zinc, bauxite. And that's an omission. And as I said, isn't it ironic that those who actually argue about the inadequacy of the current Act, which is being sought to be repealed, were actually very much those who were part of the campaign to weaken it, to weaken the original manifestation of this Act. So, on one hand, the Coalition were never in favour of having a fair tax on our shared mineral resources, and then when ultimately backing the big companies who were actually running the campaign and the original bill was weakened, and we had the minerals resource rent tax, which hasn't brought in as much revenue as it should be, they're now decrying the fact that it doesn't bring in enough revenue. I find that really very ironic. So I make the point again, our mineral resources are finite, non-renewable and can only be dug up once. The resulting wealth that we do have from exploiting those resources must be invested in Australia's future, in education, in health and in industries that will transition us then to the economy of the future. So we remain in the Australian Greens unchanged in our position that the mining tax should be strengthened rather than being abolished. We should be investing the revenue in things that are genuine and needs-based, things like true education reform, so that we can guarantee that every child in Australia, no matter where they live and no matter what their background, can have a high-quality education. And that then is an investment in our future productivity and our future economy, as well as investing in the social cohesion that comes about through people being able to reach their true potential in a community. We should also be investing in a fairer legal system. We should also be transforming the framework for mental health service delivery in Australia, which is clearly very inadequate to meet the needs of the many Australians who actually suffer poor mental health. So I'm just going to talk a bit about education first of all, and just imagine what we could do if we actually had structural reform so that those in Australia who can afford to pay more are paying their fair share. We could have great schools for every kid. The Gonski review of school funding told us so much about how we could move from the current funding system that we currently have to one where every child could have access to a high-quality education. And despite their promises on supposedly being on a unity ticket on school funding before the federal election, we have the coalition government, on the basis of not being able to afford to pay for the investment that the Gonski review indicated we absolutely need in Australia, have ripped away the 5th and 6th years of the Gonski funding out of the budget. And why? Because we don't have enough revenue, and yet here we have a government that's actually deliberately wanting to repeal a source of revenue that is arguably fair because it's on the basis of our shared resources. The bulk of the funding under the 5 and 6 years of the Gonski plan was set to flow to schools in those years. And so many schools will never be able to reach the school resource standard that was designed to bring every child up to the possibility of having an education that would be able to allow them to reach their potential. This is so much more than just a broken promise that was made by the coalition before the election. It shattered the faith of many people who had actually pinned their hopes on the idea that we could transform what is an inequitable funding system and has been for some time in Australia, and what it would mean for their students, for their kids and for their schools. The futures of our young people depend on the kinds of decisions that we make now. And being in government means having to make decisions, and having a budget means having to make decisions about how you raise revenue and what you do with the revenue you raise. And a government can actually be judged by the values that are inherent in that decision-making process. So here we have a government that is clearly saying we do not believe that those who are making large profits from our shared resources should bear their fair share to make sure that those other needs in the community, the ability to go to a doctor when you need to without having to make a co-contribution, the ability to be able to go to a school and have a good education, we don't believe that those things are valuable. They're not decisions that we are going to make, and we're not going to facilitate those kinds of services. This government will be judged harshly, and they are being judged harshly now by the Australian population, but will also be judged harshly by future Australians for the implications that flow on from the decisions that they are making today. Another area of funding that we could use proper revenue raised under structural reform would be for legal affairs. So there's no doubt that there is the state of access to justice in Australia is in crisis. And there's clear evidence across Australia that many, many people are being failed by a costly and inaccessible legal system. Increasing numbers of Australians are not able to get their legal problems resolved and their legal needs met in Australia's legal system at the moment. So justice is very often out of reach for some of our most vulnerable Australians, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, unemployed people, single parents, people on low incomes. As well as that, increasingly, there are people on middle incomes who are just not able to canvass the possibility of having their legal issues and problems resolved because the law is out of reach of those people. We have the Attorney-General citing a limited funding bucket, a limited bucket of funding, so we have to make hard decisions as the reason that he wants to restrict community legal centres and other organisations providing legal assistance to vulnerable and disadvantaged Australians. He wants them to move away from advocacy and looking at systemic issues and focus only on so-called frontline services. That is a budget measure because he acknowledges that there is not sufficient revenue coming in to the budget to be able to meet those important legal needs. Of course, there is great efficiency, great economic efficiency in those experts who are dealing at the coalface with those sorts of particular systemic issues, being able to advocate and bring their experience and their knowledge to bear to have law reform, rather than dealing on a one-by-one basis with people. And so that's a particularly effective and efficient way to fight injustice and ensure that we have proper law reform in Australia. But because of, again, the government's failure to have true structural reform to make sure that we actually have revenue coming from appropriate places in Australia, like reducing fossil fuel subsidies, like having a proper and effective resource mining taxes on the profits that people make from exploiting Australia's resources. Because of that, he says we don't have adequate funding to be able to meet the needs of serving the most disadvantaged Australians, and as a result we have great legal injustice occurring every day. Restricting an organisation's ability to do advocacy, of course, is not only an economic decision, it's actually always ideological. It's a decision that, in fact, we don't necessarily want to hear the message that there needs to be law reform if that isn't something that the government is willing to take up. So it's much easier to try to silence those critics and those who say we do need to have systemic change in Australia to make sure that some people are not being, on a daily basis, affected badly by laws that might benefit those who are better off in Australia. So it is actually an ideological position as well. We have Indigenous Australians in Australia, Mr Acting Deputy President, who are grossly overrepresented in prison populations, and the organisations providing their legal assistance are also being defunded and having reduced funding. And indeed, I met with representatives of Aboriginal family violence prevention programs and those who give advice and assistance to some of the most vulnerable Australians in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who are struggling with the fact that they'll be losing employees from their workplaces. In some cases they will be closing services. They will not be able to deliver the services that they need to deliver. And indeed, it's ludicrous to suggest that frontline services won't be affected, because very clearly from the stories that I heard today, they will be individual people on the ground who will bear the brunt of that. So there will be arguably more people who will be subject to family violence, and there will certainly be more Aboriginal Australians incarcerated. And that's a record that we already it's already a shameful record in Australia, and it's one where we arguably have some of the most imprisoned peoples in the world. We also have the defunding of environmental defenders' offices across Australia, again because of the argument that there isn't sufficient money, but again, of course, we know that's ideological. So I stand here to oppose the repeal of the MRRT, the mining tax, because I say that we need to recognise that we do need to have adequate revenue to meet the needs of the Australian community, and it's hard to argue that it's not appropriate to have a fair tax with wealthy mining companies paying their fair share for our shared finite resources.